Welcome to Bond and Bondage Helpline, where we untangle human emotions. No safe word required. I'm Stella Black. Hit the like and subscribe buttons for your weekly glimpse behind the curtain of human behavior. Let's talk about something that's often framed as a culture war problem, but is, in practice, a systems design problem: how to raise birth rates in wealthy societies without coercion, simply by making it easier and healthier for people to have the number of children they already say they want. Let's begin with the starting point that most demographers agree on. In many countries, especially in Europe and East Asia, people's desired family size still hovers around 2 children, sometimes a bit more, yet completed fertility falls short. That gap between ideals and outcomes is the signal. It tells us we're dealing less with a crisis of desire and more with a crisis of feasibility. What makes childbearing feel feasible? High-quality women's health care, equitable sharing of household and care work by men, well-designed parental leave, a strong social safety net, reasonable work hours and time off, and a civic culture that protects reproductive autonomy rather than pushing or shaming people into parenthood. That is the blueprint. And the empirical record, drawn from peer-reviewed studies across multiple regions, helps us see why. First, a quick frame from Demography. When we look at the long arc of development and fertility, the conventional story for decades was simple. As development rises, fertility falls. But at very advanced levels of development, the relationship becomes more nuanced. One influential cross-national analysis in Nature argued that once countries reach high human development, further gains can temper or even reverse very low fertility levels by making family life compatible with modern aspirations. In plain language, if prosperity and institutions are designed for dual-earner, dual-carer families, childbearing can recover from the floor. That sets the stage for why the specific components of our blueprint matter. So, let's walk the blueprint piece by piece and keep our eyes on a central mechanism, reducing the mismatch between what individuals and couples want and what their institutions, workplaces, and household arrangements make possible. Women's health care is the first pillar. Think preconception care, mental health, and obstetric safety as a continuum, not separate silos. Preconception care, things like medication review, managing chronic conditions, and lifestyle support, improves fecundity and pregnancy outcomes. In recent systematic reviews, dedicated preconception visits that include reproductive life planning and risk reduction are associated with better maternal and perinatal outcomes and with downstream improvements in infant health. That matters for fertility behavior, because fecundity isn't just biology. It's also about timely, supported attempts that don't get derailed by unmanaged health issues. There's also a mental health channel that is often underemphasized in fertility debates. Large cohort work in Scandinavia has shown that psychiatric disorders after a first birth, such as postpartum depression, anxiety, or psychosis, are associated with reduced likelihood of having another child. In a population-level sense, failing to screen and treat perinatal mental health is not just a tragedy for families. It's a quiet, preventable drag on parity progression. So, a blueprint that prioritizes universal preconception counseling, easy access to contraception to support healthy spacing, high-quality antenatal care, and serious perinatal mental health screening and treatment is not only about safety, it's about keeping open the path to the second child many parents intend to have. Now, men's equitable sharing of household and care work. If there's one message that comes through repeatedly from comparative sociology, it's this: fertility is higher and more stable when gender equality advances not only in schools and workplaces, but also inside the home. Studies from Sweden and Hungary have shown that couples who share domestic work more equally are more likely to progress to a second birth. In Sweden specifically, longitudinal evidence links domestic gender equality with transitions to first, second, and even third births. And an early but still important note from the United States found that the second shift, where women carry the bulk of domestic labor on top of paid work, constrains second births. The mechanism is intuitive. When the caregiving load sits mostly on mothers, the perceived cost of another child skyrockets. When fathers reliably share nighttime care, sick days, school logistics, and routine chores, intentions convert into births. What about parental leave? Here's where public health and labor economics meet. Natural experiment evidence from Austria showed that extending paid, job protected parental leave increased the likelihood of second births among those just eligible for the longer leave without long run penalties to maternal employment. In the Nordics, the introduction of reserved fathers' quotas, non transferable leave for dads, has been associated with stronger paternal involvement and, in some settings, with more stable unions and continued childbearing. But nuance matters. A Spanish reform granting 2 weeks of paid paternity leave led to longer spacing and, among older couples, fewer subsequent births in the following years. The lesson is not that father's leave reduces fertility, but that tiny 2 week reforms mostly change timing and may reveal opportunity costs for older cohorts. In other words, design and scale are critical. Well-paid, adequately long, and gender-balanced leave, rather than symbolic, very short leave, works better for converting intentions into births. The principle, consistent with the broader evidence, is to remove the sharp career-family trade-off at the moment of greatest strain and to normalize fathers as caregivers from day one. The social safety net is the next pillar. The research literature on child allowances and family benefits shows small to moderate, but real, positive effects on fertility, especially at low parities and among younger households, when benefits are predictable and substantial enough to change constraints. France is the canonical case. Structural models and quasi-experimental evaluations have repeatedly found that more generous benefits modestly raise birth rates, and when benefits were tightened for higher-income families, fertility among those households dipped. Israel's experience with child subsidies, analyzed using administrative data, likewise shows that when the marginal cost of an additional child falls, births increase, again, modestly but measurably. No one should oversell cash benefits as a magic lever. They won't take a country from below replacement to a sustained baby boom. But in combination with childcare, leave, and gender egalitarian norms at home, they reliably help close the gap between desired and realized births. Linked to the safety net is the cost of time. Here is where longer vacations and reasonable work hours enter. Fertility researchers increasingly point to time stress, excessively long working hours, lack of schedule control, and insufficient rest as barriers to acting on childbearing intentions. In East Asia, where hours are long, studies show that long working weeks are associated with lower intentions to have a child. In North America and Europe, preconception cohort studies link higher stress to lower fecundability. From a public health standpoint, chronic stress is not just an unpleasant feeling, it's a physiological load that can disrupt cycles, reduce intercourse frequency, and raise the risk of anovulation. Reasonable working hours, genuine vacations, and right to disconnect norms are therefore not luxuries. They're part of a fertility policy. When couples can count on predictable time away from work, the perceived feasibility of pregnancy, especially the first and second, rises. Let's add childcare availability because it stitches together several parts of the blueprint. In Norway, micro-level analyses show that accessible, affordable childcare is linked to higher fertility. The mechanism is obvious. When parents can actually find and afford a slot, the opportunity cost of a second child drops. Combine that with men's leave and participation at home, and you get the dual earner, dual carer model that underpins the most stable contemporary fertility outcomes. Childcare is also where social trust matters. Comparative research shows that generalized social trust, people's belief that others are trustworthy, buffers fertility against periods of uncertainty. When trust is high, parents are more willing to outsource care to formal providers, which helps reconcile work and family, especially for highly educated women. High-trust, high childcare societies are exactly where you see fewer collapses into lowest low fertility. Now, a word on housing and wealth effects because they complicate the story. Empirical work in the United States has found that rising house prices raise births among homeowners who feel wealthier but reduce births among non-owners who face higher entry costs. At the population level, that can wash out, especially in cities where ownership is out of reach for many in their late 20s and early 30s. This suggests that family policy on its own can be blunted by housing markets that push would-be parents into prolonged precarity, so a serious blueprint treats housing affordability and stable rental protections as fertility policy by another name. Some of you might be wondering, where does culture fit? What about religion? The evidence here is subtler than slogans allow. Cross-national research shows that religiosity tends to raise stated fertility intentions in adolescence and early adulthood, but the trajectories of intentions converge across religious and non-religious groups with age, once work-family constraints bite. In other words, pressure, religious or otherwise, to reproduce is neither necessary nor sufficient to sustainably raise births. What does matter is a value system and legal environment that protects reproductive autonomy while making parenting compatible with the other life projects people care about. When couples can choose freely, and when institutions make that choice feasible, birth rates find a healthier level. Coercion, or even just persistent shaming, often backfires by raising the perceived costs and risks of parenthood for those not prepared to accept traditional gender roles. Let me bring these pieces together with a few evidence-backed design principles. First, align gender equality across institutions and the home. Demographers have long argued that very low fertility tends to arise where women have equal access to education and paid work, but are still expected to shoulder most domestic care. The fix is not to roll back women's gains, but to bring the household and workplaces up to speed. Normalize fathers' caregiving, protect careers with high-quality, earnings-related parental leave for both parents, ensure return-to-work rights, and build childcare infrastructure that matches actual demand. Second, make the path from the first to the second birth easy. Across contexts, the drop-off from 1 to 2 children is where the system speaks loudest. If postnatal mental health is neglected, if childcare is unavailable, if fathers are peripheral, and if workplaces treat babies as private indulgences rather than a shared social good, many families stop at 1 despite wanting 2. Conversely, when couples experience the first year as supported and predictable, when late-night duties are shared, when income doesn't crater, when childcare is visible on the horizon, second births recover. Third, treat time as a fertility resource. Cap extreme working hours, protect genuine vacations, and give employees actual control over schedules. These are public health interventions with demographic consequences. Studies linking long hours and high stress to lower fecundability are telling us that recovery time is part of reproductive health. Fourth, aim for predictable, not just generous, family transfers. Cash benefits that parents can count on for years make planning safer. Consistency reduces the fear that policy will flip with the next election, which matters for decisions spread over years. Fifth, reduce background uncertainty. Stable housing, high-trust childcare systems, and social insurance that protects families from tail risks, illness, job loss, disability, make the decision to have a child feel less like a leap into the void and more like an ordinary step. Let's zoom in for a minute on the biology-behavior interface, because it connects health and sociology in a way that's easy to miss in policy debates. A large North American preconception cohort has shown that elevated perceived stress before conception is associated with reduced fecundability. That is, it takes longer to conceive. Other studies measuring salivary alpha amylase, a biomarker of sympathetic nervous system activation, have found similar patterns: higher stress, longer time to pregnancy. Meanwhile, postpartum mood disorders, when untreated, lower the likelihood of having another child. None of this is destiny. Stress is modifiable, and perinatal mental health care works. But it is a reminder that the blueprint is partly an anti-stress program. Thoughtful work design, genuine rest, continuity of care, and social support reduce stress at the very moment couples are deciding whether to try for a baby. Now, because this is a practical blueprint, I want to translate the evidence into concrete levers that any high-income democracy could pull without culture war theatrics. Start with primary care. Make a dedicated preconception visit a standard benefit for every adult of reproductive age, women and men. Include reproductive life planning, chronic disease optimization, medication review for teratogens, referral to smoking cessation or nutrition support, and a mental health screen with swift follow-up options. Integrate this with digital tools that nudge and track but keep it humane. The point is to increase the share of pregnancies that are intended, healthy, and well-timed. Screen all birthing parents for mood and anxiety disorders in late pregnancy and at multiple postpartum touchpoints. Create fast lanes into evidence-based treatments, from cognitive behavioral therapy to, where indicated, pharmacotherapy compatible with breastfeeding. Make partner engagement a routine part of care. Fathers' mental health matters too, both for the family's well-being and for sharing the load. Reform leave with 3 principles: enough time, enough pay, and an equal invitation to both parents. Enough time means months, not days. Enough pay means earnings-related replacement rates high enough that middle-income families aren't pushed into debt. An equal invitation means non-transferable quotas for each parent, plus flexibility in how leaves can be taken, continuous or in blocks across the first year or more. Pair leave with guaranteed return-to-work rights and anti-discrimination enforcement with teeth. Scale childcare on 2 dimensions: availability and quality. Availability means guaranteeing a place from around the end of parental leave, with real-time waitlist transparency so parents can plan. Quality means professional wages and training for caregivers, low ratios, and curricula that support development without pushing academic drills. Make fees income-related or cap them at a small share of household income. The payoff is not just cognitive scores in kindergarten, it's higher completed fertility because the second child no longer feels like a career-ending decision. Normalize shared care at home. Policy can nudge, but culture lives in daily routines. Make it visible. Prenatal classes for both parents. Pediatric visits that ask fathers about feeding, sleep, and sick day plans. Workplace norms that expect men to take their full leave and to use flexible hours. Media campaigns can help, but the most powerful signal is when managers, especially men, model caregiving in their own lives. Protect time. Cap excessive weekly hours. Pressure test industries with chronic overwork, and enforce rest periods. Encourage or mandate right-to-disconnect policies so evenings and vacations are real. In sectors with unavoidable peaks, healthcare, logistics, use staffing models that don't rely on heroic overtime. Remember, we don't need to change the human desire for family. We need to change whether people are too depleted to act on that desire. Stabilize housing for young families. Expand social and market rate rental supply. Offer long-term leases with predictable rent paths, and target support to first-time buyers without inflating prices. The goal is not to make everyone an owner, it's to make secure housing compatible with childbearing in the renter-majority cities where many young adults live. Keep the civic temperature low around reproduction. Societies that protect reproductive autonomy, access to contraception and abortion, protection from coercion in any direction, foster trust in institutions. Evidence on religiosity suggests that while religious commitment can shape early ideals, the actual realization of births later in life depends on structures and supports. Let families choose freely and make their choices feasible. Before I close this first half, let me acknowledge 2 objections that often come up. One says, look at the Nordics, generous policies, still low fertility, so your blueprint doesn't work. The answer is that policy is necessary but not sufficient. After the Great Recession, even high-support countries saw fertility drop, driven by delayed partnerships, housing constraints, and the spread of intensive parenting norms. But within the family of wealthy countries, those with the full bundle, childcare, equal leave, men's participation at home, reasonable hours, and social trust, have avoided the very lowest lows and maintain higher completed fertility than peers with thin safety nets and traditional gender norms at home. The second objection says, just pay people more to have kids. Cash helps at the margin, the literature shows that. But without time, care, and equality at home, money alone can't buy back sleep, health, or a second pair of trusted hands at 3 a.m. The durable route runs through redesigning how we organize care and work. You don't raise birth rates by lecturing people. You raise them by aligning institutions with the lives people actually live. Build women's health care around preconception and perinatal mental health. Give both parents time and pay to care. Put childcare where families need it. Tame work hours and protect rest. Treat housing stability as family policy. And keep freedom of choice at the center. When societies do that, they don't have to push people into parenthood. They let the families people already want become the families they actually have. Now I want to translate what we've covered into parity-specific strategy, regional lessons, measurement, and a concrete 5-year rollout that a city, province, or nation could actually deliver. I'll keep naming the evidence in a spoken style so you can trace each claim. When I say things like, as outlined in, it's your cue that the finding comes from peer-reviewed work. Start with parity, because the barriers to a first child are not the same as the barriers to a second or a third. For first births, the heavy hitters are partnership formation, housing security, and job stability. In Southern Europe, studies repeatedly show that youth underemployment and precarious contracts delay union formation in first births. As outlined in Economic Uncertainty and Fertility, written by Mikau Mick and colleagues, published in the European Journal of Population, and in complementary work summarized by Daniela Vignoli's team in Advances in Life Course Research, the signal is clear. When early career paths are unstable, first births slide later and later. The fix is not a sermon, it's a labor market and housing fix. Unclog licensing and entry barriers, discourage serial temporary contracts, expand long-term rental protections, and add family-sized units near transit so cohabitation and marriage feel feasible before age 30. Then consider the move from 1 to 2. Second births are exquisitely sensitive to the lived experience of the first year. As outlined in The Gender Revolution, written by Frances Goldscheider, Ava Bernhardt, and Trude Lapagord, published in Population and Development Review, parity progression improves where men's caregiving becomes routine, not exceptional. And as outlined in Second Births and the Second Shift, written by Berna Miller-Torr and Susan Short, published in Population and Development Review, equitable division of housework in dual-earner couples predicts the step to child number 2. The policy translation is straightforward, non-transferable, well-paid father's leave long enough to reset habits, guaranteed toddler care slots coming online as parental leave ends, an employer practice that treats caregivers as standard, not special cases. Third births are different again. They are rarer in most high-income settings, but responsive to predictable, parity-linked cash benefits and to the cumulative ease of the first 2 parenting experiences. As outlined in Child Benefits and Fertility, written by Guy Laroque and Bernard Salanier, published in The Economic Journal, predictable, long-horizon benefits nudge larger families at the margin. You don't push people into 3. You remove the obstacles that make the third feel impossible. Now, let's look outward and learn from regions that have tried big policy swings. East Asia is the urgent case because it shows what happens when prosperity climbs but gender equality at home and at work stalls, and when hours stay punishing. As outlined in Low Fertility in East Asia, written by James Ramo and colleagues, published in Population and Development Review, marriage and childbearing are tightly coupled in Japan, but the costs of marriage, especially for women, remain high under traditional role expectations. As outlined in Work Hours and Reproductive Health, written by Min Seon Park and colleagues, published in PLOS 1, very long work weeks are associated with lower fecundity among women. Combine that with late partnership and expensive urban housing, and intentions fade into the background. Korea's experiments with cash and childcare have been substantial, but as outlined in Fertility Policy in South Korea, written by Kwang Hee-jung and co-authors, published in the Journal of Population Research, effects have been limited without deeper change in male caregiving and working time norms. The lesson for everyone else is sobering. If the second half of the gender revolution, men's caregiving, doesn't materialize, and if right to disconnect norms aren't real, even generous subsidies have thin returns. Look at the Nordics, France, and Quebec. When governments offer a package of paid leave, affordable childcare, and steady financial support, birth rates don't jump, but they do hold steady, especially when families are deciding about a second child. In France, the mix of child allowances and tax rules has kept fertility around the OECD middle, and Quebec shows that low-cost daycare plus generous benefits make having 2 kids feel realistic for 2 working parents. When parental leave is long enough and job protected, more families go on to have a second child and mothers get back to work more smoothly. By contrast, very short paternity leave mostly changes the timing of births, not the total number, so token fixes don't move the needle. Leave that includes father-only, non-transferable months gets dads to actually take time off and do more care at home. The practical recipe: think months, not days. Pay a solid share of regular wages so average families can afford to use it, and reserve dedicated time for fathers from day one. Childcare is the crucial bridge between work and home. When affordable, reliable spots are available, the time burden of a second kid drops, so more parents go for it. Well-timed expansions also help parents, especially moms, return to work sooner and keep their earnings steady, which makes a second child feel financially doable. And it all hinges on trust. If families trust the quality and dependability of care, they plan differently. Health, especially mental health, is a big, often overlooked driver of family size. Good preconception care improves mom and baby outcomes. High stress before trying to conceive can make it harder to get pregnant. And untreated postpartum depression or anxiety lowers the chances of having another child. So make it practical. Offer routine preconception visits in primary care, screen and treat perinatal mood and anxiety disorders, and cover pelvic floor rehab and lactation support. In short, smoother care before, during, and after birth makes the jump from 1 child to 2 far more feasible. Housing, finally, is a quiet giant. As outlined in House Prices and Birth Rates, written by Lisa Detling and Melissa Kearney, published in Regional Science and Urban Economics, rising local house prices increase births among homeowners but reduce them among renters. In high-rent cities where homeownership is out of reach for many in their prime childbearing years, that asymmetry pulls down births. The translation into policy is to increase family size supply, stabilize rents with longer leases and predictable paths, and avoid mortgage subsidies that simply inflate prices without increasing doors. Before I lay out a 5-year plan, a word on technology and what ART can and cannot do at the population level. Assisted reproductive technologies are a lifeline for individuals and couples. They help people realize the families they want. But their macro contribution to births is modest. As outlined in Contribution of Assisted Reproduction to National Fertility, written by Tomasz Sobotka and colleagues, published in Population and Development Review, ART adds a small share of total births in high-income countries. It is helpful, but not a substitute for aligning work, care, and housing. That's why upstream fixes remain decisive. You can't fix what you don't measure. Start with the total fertility rate, or TFR. This is a snapshot of how many children the average woman would have if today's age patterns stayed the same. In wealthy countries, replacement is about 2.1. TFR moves with timing. When people have kids later, the number looks lower even if lifetime family size doesn't change. So track 2 anchors: a timing-adjusted TFR and cohort-completed fertility, which counts how many children people actually end up having. Then build a simple dashboard with signals policy can move. Track the share of leave days taken by fathers. Track dad's weekly hours in childcare. Track childcare coverage for 1 and 2-year-olds and the average wait time for a toddler slot. Track maternal complications and rates of postpartum depression. Track average weekly work hours and how often after-hours emails are sent. Track the rent-to-income ratio for 2 to 3 bedroom homes near schools and transit. Publish the dashboard every quarter so you can see in real time whether the plan is working for real families. With parity-specific insights, regional lessons, and metrics in hand, here is a 5-year rollout plan you could take from cabinet memo to street-level reality without culture war fireworks. Year 1 is design and signal. Pass a Parental Care and Time Act with 3 pillars. 6 months of paid, job-protected leave shareable by parents, with at least 2 months reserved for each parent. A childcare guarantee that every child has an affordable slot beginning at the end of parental leave, and a universal child benefit that arrives monthly from birth. Announce a right to disconnect standard and cap extreme weekly hours with enforcement teeth. Fund a perinatal mental health initiative that embeds screening in obstetrics, pediatrics, and primary care. Year 2 is build and enroll. Stand up a one-door digital portal that auto-enrolls families at birth registration. Give people a timeline of benefits and care appointments for the first 2 years. Expand training and wages for early childhood educators to secure supply. Commission an employer reporting framework that publishes fathers' leave uptake and parent retention by sector. Launch public messaging that shows fathers doing routine care, filling forms, attending pediatric visits, handling sick day logistics. The message is not propaganda, it's normalcy. Year 3 is synchronize and scale. Bring the childcare guarantee to 80% coverage for 1 and 2-year-olds. Enforce right to disconnect audits in sectors notorious for after-hours creep. Build housing pilots that add family-sized units near transit and schools with rent stability contracts. Expand pelvic floor rehab and lactation support into standard postpartum benefits. Begin cohort-based evaluation using tempo-adjusted fertility and parity-specific hazards as outlined in the Bongartz-Feeney framework published in Population and Development Review. Year 4 is consolidation. Push fathers' leave uptake above 70% through targeted communication and managerial modeling in the public sector. Tie a portion of procurement eligibility to employer performance on parent retention and schedule predictability. Finish the childcare coverage build-out with special attention to shift work hours so hospital, retail, and logistics workers can actually use the system. Year 5 is durability. Lock in multi-year funding, hardwire automatic benefit indexing to inflation, and legislate reporting requirements for the fertility dashboard so it survives electoral cycles. By this point, you are not chasing a baby boom. You are narrowing the gap between intended and realized births by removing unnecessary friction at the first and second child. People will raise 3 objections. First, we tried cash. It didn't work. Small, one-off bonuses rarely change behavior. What works is steady, predictable support bundled with childcare and paid leave. Second, the Nordics are still below replacement, so the model fails. Look at the right metric. Countries with the full bundle, leave, childcare, and cash, have higher completed fertility than similar countries without it and are less likely to hit the very lowest lows. Third, we can't afford this. Very low fertility is expensive. It speeds population aging and raises dependency ratios. Keeping fertility near replacement stabilizes growth. Modest policy costs now prevent much larger fiscal stress later. For a moment, let's return to the individual level because families do not experience policy as line items. They experience it as mornings and evenings, as clinic visits and inboxes. Imagine a couple after their first birth. Their hospital screens for postpartum depression, not only once, but at the pediatric checkups where they already show up. A brief screen catches the early signs. A referral leads to therapy that is covered and close. The father is 6 weeks into his own reserved leave, and it's not unusual in his office. His boss did the same last year. They have a guaranteed, affordable childcare spot starting when they return to work, with real-time updates visible in the portal. Their evenings are mostly their own. After-hours emails are rare because the company has shifted to true coverage rather than hero hours. Their rent is stable for 3 years. None of this guarantees a second child, but all of it lowers the friction that so often turns intention into maybe later and maybe later into never. Quick note on culture and trust. In places with higher social trust, communities bounce back from shocks faster, and intentions are more likely to become births. This comes from Social Capital and Fertility by Arnstein Asve and Francesco Bellari in Population and Development Review. The lesson isn't that slogans raise births, competence does. Services that run on time and benefits that actually arrive build quiet trust. If you want a cultural lever, aim for boring reliability. 2 quick plain English cautions. First, timing versus amount. If people have kids later, the yearly birth rate can dip even when families end up the same size. To keep your read honest, use a timing-adjusted rate and also track how many children people actually have by the end of their childbearing years. That insight comes from work by John Bongartz and Griffith Feeney in Population and Development Review. Second, one size doesn't fit all. What drives low births isn't the same for first versus second children, or across education levels and regions. Judge policy by these slices and be ready to tweak. That's the takeaway from research by Tomasz Sobotka, Eva Bourgeois, and Krzysztof Zeman in Demographic Research. Where does this leave us? With a humane, evidence-based blueprint that does not ask people to be different people. It asks institutions to be better institutions. When women's health care is comprehensive and respectful, when men's caregiving is expected and enabled, when leave is long enough and well paid enough to matter, when childcare is reliable and high quality, when schedules are sane and vacations are real, when housing is stable and has room for a crib, and when the public conversation centers autonomy rather than pressure, birth rates do not collapse. They stabilize. Sometimes they rise a little. Most importantly, they line up more closely with what people say they want. That is the definition of success in a free society. Let's stop fighting culture wars and start building what families actually need. That's how you raise birth rates in a way that lasts, by making parenthood fit healthy, modern lives. A study in Nature by Mikko Mirskila, Hans-Peter Kohler, and Francesco Bellari shows this clearly. When institutions match real life, high development and family formation can grow together. Our job is simple to say and hard to do. Make that fit real in everyday life. Trade slogans for systems, build care, time, and trust into the week. Do that, and births will follow. That's enough for now. Your scars might be on the inside, but scar patches come in all shapes and sizes. Find your patch and protect them with your life. See you soon.